I think I have not to introduce Werner Schmidt, he is well known here, but the talk he has prepared, Business Process Monitoring with S-BPM, should be the last highlight in this conference. Please, Werner.
I hope so. Thank you, Herbert. I'm going to talk about, as Herbert said, Business Process Monitoring with S-BPM. This was a joint work with Fleischmann sitting up there. And here is the agenda after a short introduction where we orientate where we are with this topic. We're going to talk about monitoring options, monitoring S-BPM as it is implemented right now in software suite supporting the S-BPM methodology. Then we're going to talk about business activity monitoring as a special form of monitoring. And then we look at work of some colleagues from the University of Münster, Liechtenstein, and Karlsruhe, who dragged up BPMN extensions for business activity monitoring. And in the next step, we try to transfer these ideas to a one concept for S-BPM. And we conclude with some ideas of what is still needed to do in future and what we found out. The two talks before mine make it easy to go over this slide. Matthias started talking about the strategic level, and if we look at this closed loop approach of performance management, we can see that business process management and the activity monitoring is down here on the operations level. So we jump into this lower part here of this closed loop, double closed loop cycle. If we talk about process monitoring, there are two columns in this table. If you look up here, we can say traditional monitoring, as we saw examples in the presentation of Marcus Ritchie at the end, where he talked about these KPIs and drilled them down in order to find causes. And on the other hand, business activity monitoring, which complements this, what we call traditional monitoring. If you look at the left column, in the left column you see some activities characteristics to distinguish a little between these two forms of business process monitoring. The measurement or computing objects are the same for the two columns. Metrics, performance indicators, which are recorded, for example, by the process engine as timestamps as we had before, or event logs from transactional systems as well. So if we look at this analysis row here, we see some differences. Traditional monitoring usually is triggered by the request of a user following a pull concept or by time elapsing, which is a push trend. On the right hand side, business activity monitoring is triggered by events occurring in our processing, for example. So it's a push mechanism. And related to that, the point of time where analysis takes place is exposed in traditional monitoring, as we've seen in the presentation of Marcus Ritchie, for example. And in business activity monitoring, we're talking about low latency analysis, which means real time or near real time. The concepts and methods behind two columns, let's say, on the one hand side, business intelligence, and on the other hand, complex event processing. You might be familiar with the abbreviation CEP, complex event processing, or what are complex events? Complex events are aggregated out of so-called single events, raw data, which, if they occur, don't have a special meaning. They get a special meaning if you combine, for example, two events. Some of you might know this special example in the fraud detection area. If a credit card is used in Munich at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and half an hour later, let's say a credit card number is used in New York, that's we cannot deviate. That's not possible. So this is an indication that there's something wrong, and this is a combined complex event where you can conclude from that. Analyzing methods on the left related to this ex post thing here in time. Usually you store and analyze, you store events, things occurring, and then after a certain time you analyze it with classical database requests and data warehouse technology. On the business activity monitoring side, the term referring to store and analysis, stream and analyze, because you always query this event stream in order to find those events occurring in the stream or in an event cloud. The technology to do this is streamlining the special tools for that, like an S-BPM engine in order to process and analyze events. Reporting and presentation, on the one hand side ad hoc and periodically, and related to the time aspect here, in the business activity monitoring case, permanently with very short refreshing intervals. We're going to skip the last two rows due to time elapsing. What I wanted to show you is some pictures on those who work with the Metasonic software in practice or in education might know this analysis already available in the software, hard-coded. Yeah? You see an instance report, maybe you remember back Marcus Rich's presentation, there was a button instance report. Push on it during execution of instances. You can see reports like this here, where you got a process name, priority, title of the process, and so on, and a little traffic light indication of duration state here, for example. Another picture, typical cockpit setting with process instance duration versus average duration in minutes, for example. Current process instance duration, share in percent, and so on. I'm going into detail now. All that is derived from the data stored by the process engine in the event log. Another example, which also can be considered as an instance report, is the recorder view during execution, because you can see, I added this slide because you can see, for example, timestamp here, when the state changed, Friday, May 6/10/07. And this might help you informing customers about the state of the order, for example, that you can tell him where the process is. And the last one, the process report, which gives you some information on how many processes, how many instances of a process took place in which month, for example, in here. So you can see distribution over time. Okay, so this was the traditional, kind of traditional monitoring. If we go to the right column in this table before, we're talking about business activity monitoring. What you see here is a so-called business activity monitoring complex event processing architecture. And if you look at the runtime area up here, you can see that according to this architecture concept, you have event producers like process engine writing an audit log, and you've got other event producers, for example, an ERP system writing a sentence of in an accounting process. And these events are stored in this event cloud or event stream and processed by the event processing logic, consisting of event processing agents, doing things like filtering events, aggregating events, like I explained before in this fraud detection example, for example. And this event processing logic produces an output. This could be an API call, which triggers another process. This could be metrics and process performance indicators, for example, displayed on a dashboard level. So this is the execution level here. But what do we need in order to get this going here? We need something at build time, which means in terms of the process engine, we need to model the processes. That's what we all know, for example, in Metasonic build them. But we also need to model things to control what these EPAs, these units here, can do. For example, we need to model events, event patterns, matrix process performance indicators to be computed here, for example, and then displayed on a dashboard. We also need to define how the results should be visualized here, for example. What kind of display, spark lines, or as we have seen, cockpit displays and so on. So this means we need some kind of modeling down here. And in terms of process performance indicators, for example, there are approaches, I hope it doesn't take too long to come up, so-called fact sheets for a process performance indicator here. As you can model something like that in a table. We don't go into details, just a few rows here, for example. Of course, PPI has an identifier in this description. You can specify a p-value, a target value, for example, and you can, or you need to define where the data comes from and what the algorithm is to compute it. Data sources, for example, here, if I go a little further down, you see tables here from the database in the Metasonics suite where you get the data from, and then the specific SQL statements in order to process this data in order to compute a PPI. So this is something you can define, but this cannot be processed yet. There are other approaches, more formal approaches like this one here. Again, a PPI template with a more formal language here, which can be exploited automatically then in order to describe process performance indicators. And now comes the idea of the colleagues from Liechtenstein and Münster and Karlsruhe. A graphical notation would be good. And the idea was to develop something like that for, I need to go back to the presentation, for, and back here, a modeling method, a modeling language, which can be used in conjunction with BPMN. If you define a modeling language, you start with abstract concepts. And one example can be seen here, an abstract meta model. It is a UML class diagram, and the PPI is duration in this example. And the definition is there's a time-consuming element, and in BPMN, this can be a process. These are the gray rectangles here, an activity, and a process section defined by a start marker and an end marker, which refer to flow nodes in the BPMN notation. Using attributes up here, you can, for example, include which kind of time you want to measure. Processing time or sustained time or idle time, for example, here. Say true and false, you can choose. And the colleagues did that for, in total, 9 meta models. You see 2 or 3 more examples here, and the complete list down here then. For example, frequency is a countable element. And again, we see the relationship to the BPMN language concept here: process, activity, data object, and data state. I chose these 3 because the 2 on the right show that there are also meta models which are not dependent on a language construct of the modeling, so the process modeling language. You don't see any gray rectangles here. Now, next step was, of course, with such an abstract model, no one can really work, an end user cannot work, the domain expert cannot work, who should set KPIs, for example. So the idea of the colleagues was to add a graphical notation for these different types of PPIs. Just an example here, duration is expressed by this little clock then, or the start markers for this process section with these things we know from a remote control for video recorder, for example, or if we look at process measures, an aggregated measure with a sum symbol, an average, and so on. it's better to show you an example which has some of these graphical symbols. And the example is a BPMN process down here, an order process initiated by an order coming in. It is analyzed, can it be fulfilled or not? If so, send order confirmation, process order, and then depending on whether the average cycle time is more than 48 hours, the goods are shipped by express or standard, and then the process ends here. And in the upper part, you can see this BAM modeling language now. For example, here you see a filter element with the last 50 instances for the last 50 instances of the process, of the purchase order process. In this case, the cycle time should be calculated and displayed on the dashboard. Another second example, the overall cycle time in average with a target value of less than 48 hours. If this is violated, a notification for the process owner should take place, and this also influences the sequence flow down here, because in that case the goods need to be shipped by express. And the third example down here, and this is another filter symbol here, which means we only take into account completed instances, which is expressed by state is equals completed down here. Third example, partial cycle time, referring to this process section here, all company internal activities, and a percentage of the whole cycle time then as an average displayed on the dashboard. Now, the idea was to transfer this to S-BPM, and this table gives the language constructs on the left. They use BPMN specification elements, the gray rectangles you've seen before, and on the right-hand side, the S-BPM specification element like process, subject, behavior states, and so on. So we could easily map the specification element from BPMN to the ones in S-BPM. As an example again, duration, there's no big difference. We had process and activity in BPMN. We do have process and state, with the state transitions here, also marked by start marker and end marker. What adds to in the subject-oriented case is the subject. You can define to measure the duration of a subject. So how many times the subject occupied in the instance. Again, the graphical modeling language attached to the S-BPM model now. We've got 3 subjects. They were not included in the BPMN diagram. There were no pools. We added the subjects here. And as you can see, this was the part of the company internal process. It's easy to do it here in S-BPM, just attach this definition here to the subject sales, because customer and parcel service are outside our organization. And everything else didn't change. If we go to a behavior diagram, you can see the possibility, the opportunity to define duration, for example, for a process section, a behavior section, again, which is not different from what we've seen before. So, to come to an end, what are the conclusions of our investigation? We've seen that the S-BPM tool environment already offers a lot of monitoring features, and we've also seen that this approach by the colleagues from Münster, Karlsruhe, and Liechtenstein, one name is Friedenstadt et al., is suitable for S-BPM 2, and maybe it's even easier to use with S-BPM. And this is the future work in order to more deeply investigate these opportunities and also to investigate opportunities for a tool support for modeling this. Of course, this is all brought in PowerPoint at the moment. But as S-BPM models are executable, the option to model these PPIs and attach it to the S-BPM models could also maybe offer the option to have this business activity monitoring models being executable with the right algorithms behind. This is something we need to think of and maybe come up with some ideas in order to get there. And the last point is what we were talking about now. I go back to this example. We're just looking at, let's say, metrics, PPIs, which are independent from the process content, which means we're talking about cycle times, for example, but we're not talking about metrics which are stored in business objects computed with the process instances, for example. This also could be an option to think of whether it makes sense to include more language constructs into this BAM modeling language, which allows us to model the access to content of a business object. If we ask, for example, what is the average ordering quantity in a certain process, this is process content dependent, but it could also be worthwhile to look into this. Well, that's all about it. Thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. Questions from the audience?
We've got a BAM expert.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I think that it definitely makes sense to include in this language also business objects and relevant data and KPIs, because they are very important when you analyze real processes, instances. My question is, did you take into account any organizational issues and aspects of process analysis? I mean, you have to be able to define which data you can provide accessible. Who is the process owner or process instance owner or the participant of the process, and how to define this in the model?
Short answer here. We did not yet. We're talking about, for example, this area here. How do we control who gets which kind of information? We didn't take this into account yet. I didn't think of whether it's necessary to put it into the model or whether there might be another, let's say, layer where this can be controlled. I'm thinking of the organizational server. We heard about something, I think it was yesterday, could be an option where this could be realized. I'm not quite sure whether the BAM model is the right place to do that. Of course, it needs to be done, but I'm not quite sure currently where this would make sense. And the same is valid for what you said first, and the issue I raised by myself with this business object content. Because what are the cases where business object content is needed in real time? This is from my point of view now, without thinking too long about it, is more relevant if I look back in time, in order to take some, to get some hints of how maybe to redesign the process, but not maybe on an instance level at real time. Right, that could be an aspect.
Thank you. Another questions? I have a question, maybe.
Yeah.
Monitoring and the results of monitoring is always a good chance to find or get ideas for optimization to make things better. Is this an idea in the future on your concept?
Yeah, again, of course, this information needs to be fed back to other activity bundles in our cycle. And the question is whether it needs to go in a model like this. Where is it? Always we can think about it, but at the moment I'm not quite sure whether it's the right position. But yeah, if we talk about modeling, like what is it? Oops. Here, presentation styles, for example. This of course has to do with the target group, and this could be the anchor point to get there. What you mentioned. So there is a connection, but we need to think of how this can be put together.
Thanks. Okay. Another question? Perhaps the last question on that.
Yeah.
For your monitoring, you assume that all relevant data is in the log information. And what I experienced is that many of the information you need for monitoring is not in the log information. You have to have additional KPIs to measure something. For example, you have to have the department of a user, which is not part of the log information, which has to be, let's say, evaluated during process time by some tricks, for example.
Yeah, good point. I agree with you. And okay, the example I think that's again maybe to tackle by using this organizational server. Yeah. Currently, it's as far as I know, it's not recorded because you don't have the information in flow. You just have in the user management. Yeah. What other examples we have for information not included in the event log?
I see quite often that you have some KPIs put down,
Yeah.
and then you want to break them down.
Yeah.
Those values, they have to be gathered somewhere. They are not in the process from the very beginning.
Yeah.
You have to add those values. You have to think about those values.
Yeah. So we should think of adding some elements maybe to the model for data sources not included in the event log, and then to track back where they can be achieved from. Okay.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for another excellent talk, for an excellent discussion.